Mr. Kamran disagreed. order. Unless those changes, unless those interventions are done, the IMF support does not take you any far. As Salehudin, with his experience of central bank, said that that the construction has a high price. Now, on HIPI, highly indebted poor countries, the refusal to do that started in the late 90s when the program had been launched globally. The Bangladesh government, that was the Awami League government, which was not in favor of it. I was the ERD secretary, so I had a role in persuading the government that we should not do the HIPIC. The BNP government came much later. So if some people have to take responsibility for not responding to the invitation to join the HIPIC group, I think I should give some credit to Dr. Farashuddin, who was then the governor of Bangladesh Bank, and I was then the ERD secretary. And one of my colleagues who stood with us is late Soed Abdul Samad. He was the principal secretary, so our access to the prime minister was more or less through Soed Abdul Samad. So, if you blame for not responding to that, or if you give him credit for not doing that, these three people should be recognized. That doesn't mean that the subsequent government also shouldn't be recognized, because our tradition is whenever the party in the government changes, the earlier decisions are reversed. But here was a case where the national pride was recognized by the two parties which took the responsibility for running the government at that time. There's a lot of talk about corruption. I would not say whether it is there or it is not there, or what is the breadth of this corruption. I would not say anything about that. But if you look at Vietnam, the more recent political move of Vietnam is crack down on corruption in the party. So it is unlikely that you would have a flow of investment in a situation where certain economic behavioral patterns have already been established, where the foreign direct investment would immediately change that pattern of behavior. And the non-democratic countries have initiated severe crackdown on corruption. It doesn't mean that we should be indifferent to corruption, and the government has declared zero tolerance for corruption, and it is being tackled by the government the way it could. About 100 economic zone, I agree with Mr. Ghafoor and also disagree with Mr. Ghafoor. Well, he's not there. Some of the speakers did talk about the absence of a policy for certain sectors. If you look at that, and if your policy is to diversify and enhance export production, you have to give some indication to the people who invest that these are the infrastructure facilities and these are the policy facilities which are available to them. This 100 economic zone, some of which are privately done, to be done privately, is an indication of that policy which would attract the investors to put their money in there. I have talked about exchange rate management. Now, Korean example, I think Tawhid Hussain had referred to young ones. Was it? Okay. Young ones got their first allotment of land from the Railway of Bangladesh in 1993 or 1994. It was too small for their purpose, so they did not take it. Incidentally, I was then the Secretary of Railway. Later on, when the Awami League government came in, they got a huge area in Chittagong, on the other side of Kornofuli. There was a disagreement between the government and young ones about the price of the land. The government's assessment included the loss of the alternative use of the land. Young one's point was that there is no habitation in this area, therefore there is no further loss than the price of the land without any crop or other area housing. So they were right. They went to the court and they won. The verdict of the court went in their favor. The next problem was they wanted that the government's authority for issue of licenses and for approval of investment types should be transferred to them. The government and they never came to an agreement on that issue. My personal view was that the government could specify the type of investments which could be made there, but the investors has to go by the rules that is applicable to foreign investment. Now, the government could not hand over those powers to the investor in the economic zone. Secondly, perhaps the government could have placed its own official with them who would exercise that power on behalf of the government, but also could consider the imperatives from the young one's perspective. So this conflict of how much of governmental power should be exercised by the Korean economic zone and how that could be done, that remained a point of difference between the government and young one. Now, Ranjit, who has much better information than I have about the government's capability of planning, programming, and so on, I understand there are two committees. One looks at the government's resources and expenditure in the context of the budget. Ranjit, you correct me if I am wrong. And there's another committee with Bangladesh Bank, which looks at external debt. And it was transferred to Bangladesh. It used to be done by ERD, but sometime in the 1980s, it was transferred to the central bank on the argument that ERD looks only at the government debt, but the private debt should be considered within the overall program of external debt that the country can raise. So that is how it went to Bangladesh Bank, and Bangladesh Bank looks at the viability of the proposed project for which private sector loan would be incurred. It also looks at the burden of a foreign loan from a overall perspective. I think that was an improvement on that. How to attract FDI? Again, I hesitate to respond to the question raised by Professor Rahman Subhan, but I will share my experience with you. I was chairman NBR in 91, 92, and BIDA was then called BOI. The chairman of BOI was Mustafizur Rahman, again another student of Professor Rahman Subhan, who had done his stint at alternate executive director of the World Bank. So at that point of time, as now, that agency makes recommendation to the several agencies for their decision, which could facilitate the foreign direct investment. So I proposed to Mr. Mustafizur Rahman, under whom I had served for a long time, that the power of the NBR with respect to waiver of taxation should be given to him. If he makes a recommendation on his satisfaction that this would be helpful for foreign investment, he can give that order for waiver, and NBR will accept it at least as long as I remain the chairman. The second was, one of the problems at that time, I guess that continues even now, was that the site where the investor would like to locate his project doesn't have utility connections. So the agency would recommend to Planning Commission to make that connection. I said that, if he agreed, I would recommend to the government and the Planning Commission to place an amount at the disposal of BOI, which on its satisfaction would allocate money. Mr. Mustafizur Rahman declined both. His argument was that you cannot take a decision about a specific investment in respect of tax waiver unless you know the totality of the tax policies. Since the BOI does not know the totality of tax policy, it is difficult for it to say whether a tax should be waived or not. But if it appears to the BOI that tax waiver for a particular investment would be helpful, it can make a recommendation. Similarly, about decision on investment by the government, it has to know what is the government's overall program for investment. It cannot pick up a particular project and say, okay, spend 50 million or 50 crore for extending the connection to this particular project. So that was very clever. The problem we face arises from the fact that all these departments have their authority and they exercise their judgment as to what can be done and what may not be done. It would be good if all these powers could be centralized in one place, but then you have to consider whether such an organization would become an overpowering agency, and it would be very difficult to control the exercise of the power, whether they do it judiciously or not. That is an important thing. But a better coordination between the agencies and BIDA, that is important. What else did I write here? Did I leave out something? Budget support, calling package, Padam Shilota, HIPIC, hot term loan, corner corruption, settler. Okay, I think I touched on the point that I could understand and write down. Finally, I have a request, both to the organizers of the seminar and particularly to the media. When you read the media and the headlines particularly, they pick up a particular point, by and large, which is strongly critical of the government. There is no justification for the media not to be critical. But what they miss is the nuances of the discussion. By missing the nuances of the discussion and the critical arguments, they convey a wrong impression to the people. Now, all of us recognize that we need to, at least I recognize about productivity. All of us recognize a more intelligent management of exchange rate. Now, you can summarize it saying that the agency responsible for exchange and management has not done it properly. But that carries a wrong impression. The point that I tried to make is that there are some parameters which are to be honored in order to make a more intelligent and more sensible exchange and management. Unless that is done, the problem will remain. Maybe we will not face it sometimes, maybe we'll face it at some point of time. So unless these nuances and the critical arguments are reflected, then that creates a kind of nervousness in the people's mind. That nervousness does not help the government or the state at all. I would not say government, but it does not help the nation at all. To the extent the media carries the nuanced expression and the critical consideration that should be applied to making decisions affecting public interest, that is helpful. So that would be my request to the uh, media, and it would be good if the organizers also could consider at some point of time, maybe not at this moment, that they also issue a summary statement of the discussion done and the recommendations which emanate from the discussion. There will be some revision perhaps in the light of the discussions and the points that have been made by all the speakers present. That would also be helpful to those who make the decision. Let me conclude by thanking thanking the research done by Professor Mustafizur Rahman, the contribution made by Devo Priyo, whom I heard after a long time, and all the participants and the present, and particularly to Professor Rahman Soban, who has retained his interest in public policy. I think it started from before 1971, and it has continued as strongly and as actively as now. Now, if you forgive me, I would go back to an older story, which is a compliment to Professor Rahman Soban. In 72, 73, there was a discussion with the government of India about setting up a fertilizer factory in Bangladesh, which will be purchased also by India. It did not materialize. The government changed, the prime minister was assassinated, and so on. Professor Nurul Islam records that experience. The industry ministry raised some objection to that at the last moment, that they had not been involved in consideration of the project. But Professor Islam says that they were given the responsibility to assess the feasibility of the project. After they had said that it is feasible and we should go for it, the planning commission had carried on further discussion with Indian government. But there is an element of frivolity in that. The industry ministry later came up with the point that if India puts in money and we cannot supply the required amount of fertilizer to India, is there a guarantee that the Indian army will not march? This is the frivolity of the whole exercise. So that in our discussion, we should eliminate that frivolity. We say that we are, for half a century, we are independent country. But that frivolity has not been eliminated from our discussion, from our perception. Let me thank you all and my respect again to Professor Rahman Soban.
Thank you, Honorable Dr. Mashur Rahman, our chief guest today. আমাদের আমরা প্রায় 1 ঘন্টার বেশি সময় পিছিয়ে আছি, সো আমাদের যে আলোচনা খুব সমৃদ্ধ আলোচনা হয়েছে, এগুলোর সামারি করার সময় এবং সামর্থ্য দুটোই নেই। এখন আপনাদেরকে আমি একটা হাত দেখতে পাচ্ছি, রিজভি।
জি আপা, আসসালামু আলাইকুম। স্যারের কাছে একটা প্রশ্ন ঠিক না, মানে স্যার আমরা তো গণমাধ্যম থেকে অনেকেই বসে আছি স্যার, আপনার বক্তব্য শুনলাম। আমি রিজভি নওয়াজ, চ্যানেল আই কাজ করি। স্যার আজকের যে সাবজেক্টটা, এটা স্যার আপনার বক্তব্য থেকে আমরা আসলে পরিষ্কার না। স্যার আপনি যদি একটু বাংলাতে বলেন যে এটা আমাদের জন্য উদ্বেগের কিনা স্যার, যেটা নিয়ে আলোচনা হলো স্যার, আমরা বুঝি নাই স্যার।
শুনুন, আমার যদি এই সবকিছু পরিষ্কার করার ক্ষমতা থাকতো, তাহলে তো আমি শিক্ষকতা করতাম। আমার ক্ষমতা কোনো নথিতে লিখে টেকে একটা সই দেওয়া। যাই হোক, আপনি যখন অনুরোধ করেছেন আমি বলি, একটি হলো যে আজকে আলোচনা ছিল যে আমাদের যে টাকার ডেপ্রিসিয়েশন, ইনফ্লেশন রেট ইত্যাদি সম্পর্কে। সেখানে আমি আলোচনা থেকে যেটা বুঝেছি এবং আমার বক্তব্য যেটা আমি বলার চেষ্টা করেছি, সে হলো যে এক্সচেঞ্জ রেটটা শুধু আমাদের না, সারা পৃথিবীতে একটা শক পেয়েছে। প্যান্ডেমিক, ইউক্রেন ওয়ার, হামাস, প্যালেস্টাইন, এবং এই যে disruption of the supply chain, disruption of the production, etc. এর ফলে একটা শক হয়েছে। আর আমাদের যেটা আছে সে হলো যে ইকুইলিব্রিয়াম এক্সচেঞ্জে যেটা হওয়া উচিত সেখানে না রেখে আমরা টাকাকে সবসময় ওভার ভ্যালু করছি। তো ওভারভ্যালু করার সময় যখনই এই চাপ আসছে, সেই চাপটাকে আমরা সম্পূর্ণভাবে গ্রহণ করতে পারি নাই। এজন্য দরকার আমাদের প্রোডাকশন বাড়ানো। প্রোডাকশন বাড়াবার সাথে সাথে একটা বড় হলো, যেটা আমি বলেছি, অন্যরা সেটা গ্রহণ করেন কিনা জানি না, যে উৎপাদনশীলতাকে বাড়াতে হবে। 10 টাকা ইনভেস্ট করে যদি আমি এখন 11 টাকার উৎপাদন করি, সেখানে আমাদেরকে 11.5 টাকা উঠাবার চেষ্টা করতে হবে, 12তে উঠাবার চেষ্টা করতে হবে। সেজন্য ইনভেস্টমেন্টও দরকার। শুধু ডেপ্রিসিয়েশন দিয়ে এক্সপোর্ট বাড়ানো যাবে না। ডেপ্রিসিয়েশনের সঙ্গে সঙ্গে প্রোডাকশন ক্যাপাবিলিটি এটাও বাড়াতে হবে, ইনভেস্টমেন্টও বাড়াতে হবে। যতদিন পর্যন্ত বা যদি আমাদের ডোমেস্টিক সেভিংস এবং ডোমেস্টিক্যালি ফাইন্যান্সড ইনভেস্টমেন্ট না বাড়ে, এবং সেজন্য আমাদের বিদেশি সহায়তা, বিদেশি ঋণ, বিদেশি ইনভেস্টমেন্টের দরকার হবে। এগুলো কোনোটাই খারাপ না, কিন্তু যেটা সবাই বলেছেন যে এগুলো কোথায় যাচ্ছে এবং কিভাবে ব্যবহার করা হচ্ছে, কোন প্রকল্পে বিনিয়োগ করা হচ্ছে, সেই প্রকল্পের মান কি, এগুলো অনেক খেয়াল করে আহ, আহ, বিবেচনা করতে হবে। ডক্টর মুস্তাফিজুর রহমানের পেপারটা খুবই সমৃদ্ধ এবং সেখানে জানার অনেক কিছু আছে। এবং আর একটা আমি বলবো যে উনি খুবই বিবেচনার সাথে ওনার কথাগুলো বলেছেন। কোথাও কোনো অত্যুক্তি নাই বা কোথাও কাউকে বিশেষভাবে দোষ দেওয়া নাই। তার সাথে আমার সাথে হয়তো কিছুটা দ্বিমত আছে, কিন্তু সেটা ওনার প্রতি অশ্রদ্ধা নয়। আর দেবপ্রিয়কে আমি বিশেষভাবে করেছি, বিবেচনা করেছি এই জন্য যে ওর সরকারের সাথে কাজ করার অভিজ্ঞতা আছে, এবং একদম তার সাথে অভিজ্ঞতা নাই এটা বলা ঠিক হবে না। অনেক ক্রুশিয়াল কাজেও ও সরকারের সাথে কাজ করেছেন। আর আমি সবসময় যেটা বলি, প্রফেসর রহমান সুবহানকে গুরু হিসাবে আমি মনে করি, সম্মান করি। তাকে আমি সবসময় সেই সম্মানটা দেই। আমি খুব সংক্ষেপে বললে এইটুকুই বলতে পারবো।
অনেক ধন্যবাদ। আমি সবাইকে আরেকবার সিপিডির পক্ষ থেকে ধন্যবাদ জানাচ্ছি এতক্ষণ দীর্ঘ সময় ধরে আমাদের সাথে থাকার জন্য, আলোচনায় অংশগ্রহণ করা এবং আলোচনা শোনার জন্য। আবার দেখা হবে। ভালো থাকবেন, সুস্থ থাকবেন।